On the back of this book, highlighted there in a lighter color of blue, is the excerpt by John W. Cassell. Jack Engelhard is a writer without peer and the conscience of us all. I wanted to have the pages turning as I go backwards through this book. This particular story I plan to read today, it's number 5 out of 18. An Escape from Mount Moriah by Jack Engelhard. The Sewing Machine. The Mahlers were strange people, which would not have bothered me, except that we lived with them. There was Mr. Mahler, who hardly ever said a word. Mrs. Mahler was a hunchback. The two kids were cute and wonderful, but then there was their uncle, Mr. Mahler's brother, and Herschel was his name. But Herschel came later. From the start there was tension. Here we were, a family of 4 occupying a single room on Saint-Urbain Street. The rest of the house belonged to the Schwartzes, who one day moved out. The Mahlers moved in, and there we were. They could have thrown us out, but they didn't, not right away. They were refugees themselves, greener in fact than we were. We'd already been in Montreal since the mid-1940s, and they'd just arrived from France. There they had tarried after the war. Both Mr. and Mrs. Mahler had death camp tattoo marks on their arms. I had no notion of what they'd endured, but Mrs. Mahler carried herself well. I was a bit in love with her. Yes, there was that terrible affliction on her back, but her cheerfulness and good nature were so forceful you saw nothing but her radiant face. She was French in all the right ways. As we became familiar, she'd be offended if I did not kiss her first when I got home from school. Always, at that time, she had milk and chocolates prepared for me. And hunchback or not, she had a French eye. She told me that the boy next door was handsome. I sulked. She said, "But of course you are much more handsome." Her husband, who knew what made him what he was. Silence was all I ever knew of him. He was tall, slow-moving, and his face was long, sad, and hollow, in the manner of Abraham Lincoln. I sensed great tragedy in him, a man raging inside from a gathering of secrets. I was never quite sure whether we were one of his secrets. What were we doing in this house? What were we doing in his house? Did he ask for us? But here we were, and possibly he resented the fact of our presence, or maybe not. Certainly and emphatically he ignored us. But I cannot say we were the root of his haughty indignation. He had no friends other than his radio. This, a big black standing box in the living room, he listened to all evening, turning the knobs back and forth. We all shared the same bathroom, and we managed. My mother and Mrs. Mahler shared the same kitchen, and she managed. When it came to sharing other people's homes, my mother had become a professional. When conflicts approached, it was she, my mother, who yielded. There was peace between our two families, but as my mother used to say, we are Hitler's children. This made us the heirs of wrath, and with the Nazis gone, at least in those uniforms, we had it mostly upon ourselves to practice vengeance. Now, as with all things, good or bad, Herschel came upon us unexpectedly. We did not even know Mr. Mahler had a brother. But one day here he came, and here he was, and here he stayed. He was a short, dark man with busy movements. Yet, busy was the word for Herschel. Though I kept no books on him, it's possible to say he worked 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. Where? In a closet that he turned into a workroom. Was he happy working in such confinement? Of course not. He wanted our room, which he'd had his eye on from the start. In fact, he was not a shy man at all. When he first saw us, that day he walked in with his sewing machine, he said, "Who are these people?" Did I say sewing machine? Of course, because this was the beginning and end of it all. In case I forgot to mention it, Herschel was a tailor or something. He did piecework for large clothing manufacturers, and his dream was to make enough money to build his own factory. Thus he sewed morning to midnight on a Singer machine that roared even for the dead. For the living, like ourselves, the din pierced every thought and shattered body and soul. We woke up and went to bed to the thunder of Herschel's machine. Did my parents complain? First of all, they were here at their mercy, so we were in no position to complain. Second, as my father used to say, quoting the sages, "Why should any man complain? It's enough that he's alive." Third, my parents admired Herschel. What was greater than earning a living? So my father and mother did not begrudge Herschel his sewing machine. The neighbors were another story. They were not happy about the relentless noise. They never said so to us in words, but their looks spoke their minds. As for Herschel, he was impervious to everything. He seemed as though he wanted to drive everybody out, family, neighbors, but most of all us. If they didn't like it, I once heard him say to his brother, "Let them go. Let them go." Yes, he wanted us to go. He wanted our room. We did not leave for this reason. The rent was low. We could not afford another place. Moving itself, even to another room in another house, might cost $20. Who had $20? A security payment might cost $50. Who had $50? So we stayed. One day I came home from school and the house was empty. Where were my milk and chocolates? Where was Mrs. Mahler? Come to think of it, where was the roaring, ear-splitting noise from the sewing machine? My parents I found in the room, ashen from fright. Something terrible had happened. The police and my father, my mother was too grief-stricken to speak, had come and confiscated Herschel's sewing machine. This is so terrible, I thought. But yes, it was, because Herschel, and through Herschel's accusation, the Mahlers as well, were holding us as the informers. God forbid, said my mother, that we should confiscate a man's livelihood. They spoke in whispers. An arrangement had been made. So long as my parents stayed in the room, they'd be unharmed. If they stepped out, anything might happen. That went for me, too. The Mahlers, meanwhile, were in the kitchen brooding, mourning the sewing machine that was the source of their living. For us, it turned out, that's what sustained them all. As it turned out, that's what sustained them all. My mother said that immediately after the sewing machine had been taken away, Mrs. Mahler came after her with a knife. Mrs. Mahler? Herschel had said, according to her, kill her. In the end, said my father, everything comes home, even lies, which I didn't understand. But this I understood. We were as if in prison. We could not leave the room for food, air, or even the bathroom. I had come in during some sort of lapse, because Herschel had threatened to strangle the first one of us he saw. Mr. Mahler? He had said nothing, yet because of that silence we feared him most of all. Herschel, the big talker, would probably do nothing. But Mr. Mahler, he was like stillness before lightning. I felt an urge to protest and be a hero by means of going out and pleading our innocence, especially before Mrs. Mahler. I could not have lost her affection over the turn of a single event, an event so false. But no plea of mine, said my father, would be heard. The hatred and violence were already cast. Tale-bearing, he said, was one of the greatest evils of our people. So costly had betrayal been to our people, from Moses' time through Roman times, that a curse was pronounced against tale-bearers even in our 18 benedictions. Once accused of that sin, there was no forgiveness. The untruth of this, the injustice of this accusation against my father and mother, overwhelmed my pity for the Mahlers. Not for a moment did I think of their straits when our predicament was so pressing. In the other room, people were plotting, waiting for us with knives. We slept fitfully that night with full bladders. In the morning I was not sent to school. My father did not leave for work. My mother stayed put. No food. The Mahlers were still in the kitchen. Not even up in the Pyrenees with Nazis potentially behind every bush did we know such fear. Yet we were in a time of peace among our own people. How, I wondered, do things get so twisted? Why? I asked my father again and again. Don't you just tell them it was our neighbors? Tell them the truth. They don't want to hear, he said. He knew false accusation, that it had shape, breath, and life. He said false accusation was a demon. Like all demons, it was formed by God on the 6th day of creation. But before he could complete the demon came the 7th day, the Sabbath, and God rested. So for evermore the demon remained unfinished. So this, unfinished, and so it would remain. My mother made the first and last attempt at peace. She stepped out to go to the bathroom. Mr. Mahler blocked her path. Quickly turn back for the sake of your life, he said. My father ran out to rescue her. What are you doing? He asked her, and walked her back. That evening we packed our suitcases and in the middle of the night escaped with our belongings. But for me, there was no counting or measuring all that we had left behind. All that we had left behind. So many times.